Welcome to the latest episode of Five on the Floor on the Five Reasons Sports Network. Thanks for joining us on your favorite podcast app, on Apple Podcasts, on Android, Spotify, or the Five Reasons YouTube channel. Also, make sure you subscribe to Off the Floor. That's our Discord server. Link is right here in the description. If you click on that one, you'll bypass the Apple upcharge. Pay $2.99 a month. You can cancel anytime to get you access to 10 channels, including our draft channel. We have a transactions channel on there. It's a place for heat information, conversation, consternation, and lately, with a 5-game winning streak, a little bit of celebration. So check it out. We got stage shows there too. It's Off the Floor. Also, check out Prize Picks. Use the code FIVE, F-I-V-E. They brought just about everything back to the original game. Yeah, we know that, the folks in Hollywood, they have a lot of pull in Tallahassee. They push Prize Picks out for a little bit, but they're back. Use the code FIVE. Get $50 to play right away. Get all of their promotions like Taco Tuesday, Flex Fridays. Yes, you can flex play in Florida now again as well. You can play across the sports spectrum up to 6 players together. Check it out. It's prizepicks.com. And now, today's episode.
Mercy, luxurious, Heat Nation, yeah, Mercy and Lago, down to Biscayne, yeah, five on the floor, ride for my dogs, where here's the thing, you can check the score, hustle hard, couple scars, wearing bubble frogs, down to Biscayne. Kept the floor playing, got it all banned. Y'all seen the block, stop with one hand. And Pat we trust, it's power have the guts. We're here to bring the heat, y'all can hang it up.
Welcome to Five on the Floor, a daily insider show on the Miami Heat and the NBA, featuring Ethan Skolnick, Greg Sylvander, Alex Toledo, Brady Hawk, and others from the Five Reasons Sports Network. Also, make sure to subscribe to Off the Floor for the most heat anywhere.
All right, welcome back to Five on the Floor. Here's today's floor plan. I'm Ethan Skolnick. You can follow me at Ethan J. Skolnick. And at Five Reasons Sports, I got Greg Sylvander. You can find him at Greg Sylvander. I remember when we started this thing, I was clean shaven and you had the beard. Looks what's happened to the two of us
We've
over
switched
time.
it up. Not for long.
We've not
April
for me either.
Fools.
Yeah, I guess so. I can't take it anymore. Actually, I've tried. I've trimmed. I've done a whole bunch of things, but it's not. And my daughter doesn't like it. So eventually, that's what wins out. Let's get to today's topic, today's floor plan. Make sure you check out the episode that I did with Alex. Well, first, a couple things. The post-game show that you did with Brady. We're splitting up a little these days. You did with Brady after the Heat, their fifth straight. This one against Washington. Yeah, but it's 5 straight double-digit wins. I know the competition has not been great, even though Golden State's in there, but there was no Curry. Jimmy didn't show up either. But they are averaging 20.2 point margin in these victories. I mean, they're not giving up the leads late. They've done some of this without Wiggins, some of it without Duncan Robinson. They've gotten Burks to step up. Larson has stepped up. So check out the other episode, which is the one that I did with Alex, where we talked about whether or not Pelle Larson has passed Jaime Jaquez, not just now, because it's clear that he has at the moment, but in the future. But while we're doing that, we're also handling the parallel tracks here. So one of them is draft related. I'll continue to do episodes with Matt Hannafin and Adele. Final Four coming up, and there's some potential Heat targets in there, depending on where their pick lands. It seems to be dropping, but the Golden State pick may be getting better. So we'll see as this goes forward. But the other thing we want to do is look ahead towards like the bigger prizes down the road. And so that's what Greg and I are going to do here. And we know that Heat fans, most of them, are not going to be satisfied with just adding a couple of picks, right? Having then their picks be unprotected. They say they will be now, but they won't be. Just adding a couple picks to the current roster and not doing anything dramatic. They want orcas, they want whales. They don't believe in the organization to get those things anymore, because they haven't been able to get one since 2019. Kyle Lowry was kind of in his one-off season that he was available, but other than that, they haven't landed the guy, okay? And now they're watching Donovan Mitchell lead Cleveland to the number 1 seed in the East. Of course, things not going as well for Dame, unfortunately. Kevin Durant, somebody we'll talk about here. Phoenix, not going so well for him there either. Now he's injured. They may not even make the play-in. They may not even get in ahead of Dallas, which literally traded a franchise player. But we still want to talk about the possibility here. And here is something that I've heard from a couple folks inside the organization, and I want to get your take on it. They don't want to manage aging stars anymore. What does that mean to you?
Wow. Okay. This is, how do I want to start here? Managing aging stars. I think, to your point, is that also the acquisition process is part of that? Because I think there's a part of me that says that they'll manage their aging Bam Adebayos of the world and things like that, right? But I think this is about, if you look at the next build, how are they going to find the key piece? And there's players out there like Kevin Durant that may be available, and that's the most prominent name. I'll stay there. But that would be, again, managing an older star. I think these are the things that I have to wrestle to the ground about this. One is, if you're not going to go for an aging star or somebody who has some level of warts, you're going to have to either pay top dollar or get really lucky. And I just don't think luck is a strategy. Hope is not a strategy either. So you're basically going to have to eventually acquire and accumulate enough assets, one, and then be willing to part with those assets, two, for a player that's in their prime, closer to maybe when they traded for Zoe, or when they, when Chris Bosh and LeBron came. The guys are in their prime. You're not managing the later years of their career. I just don't see how you acquire one of those players. Like, let's say Ja Morant, like, let's just use him as an example. I think you're going to have to really pay a hefty price. And the Heat haven't been willing so far to pay that in all cases. And in some cases, they don't have enough assets to pay the price, even if they're willing to do so. So those are just initially a couple of the things that I feel like need to be unpacked.
Well, all right, so let's start with the first part, which is the acquisition process, which I don't think is really what they're saying. Although I think some Heat fans may look at that statement that they don't want to manage an aging star anymore and say, well, they just don't want to pay for one. And by that, they mean financially, but what they really mean, or what the fans will think that means, is in terms of asset, the assets that you give up. And of course, the Heat have been without some of the assets that other franchises have had, because they haven't wanted to tank and get those picks, and they've had to give away some picks to take care of mistakes, and then they gave away a pick to get a mistake in Terry Rozier. So that makes it more challenging for them to do certain things. They recouped a pick in the Jimmy trade. We'll see where that one is with Golden State, but they're still dealing with the protections on OKC, and there's just stuff that they've had to deal with where they haven't had necessarily the pieces. But they've also had situations where, like, they've gone after a player like Kevin Durant, or at least inquired, and they've made what they felt to be a reasonable offer, which is, you take our problem, we'll take yours. Okay, we'll give you Jimmy's contract, take Jovic, take a first. And Phoenix came back and basically asked for every talented young player on the roster plus picks and swaps. I mean, there is a middle ground there, and it was clear that Phoenix was not willing to do it, so the Heat moved on from it pretty quickly. But I think it's really more the managing of the aging star when they're on the roster. I think that's more what they're getting at. I'm going to take them at face value on that, which is, not every aging star is going to be as difficult as Jimmy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Problems behind the scenes, which I hope this, and I don't want, I'm done with the whole bashing thing and all the rest of this. Okay, more power to him if he performs in Golden State. But I think when you saw how he reacted with his teammates when he came back, with the former coaching staff, etc., things Bam said after, in a very good interview that Anthony Chang did in the Herald, where it is what it is. Okay, we didn't really expect any different. I think now we weren't lying about some of the stuff that was going on behind the scenes, and how the people that he worked with on a daily basis were forced to deal with it, that he didn't have a lot of allies in the locker room by the end. He really had two, maybe two and a half, if you include Kevin's role, which I think Kevin, from my understanding, Kevin's role in it was more sort of caring about Jimmy's well-being than really taking a side necessarily, which is why I think the organization was okay with it. But clearly he'd broken a lot of relationships, and that's with players who are getting paid handsomely to deal with the bullshit. Imagine what the staff was dealing with. So I just, which is not getting paid as handsomely. So I just want to make that clear, okay, that we were not lying. Okay, we were not lying, all right, about any of that stuff, and more will come out over time. But I don't know if it matters that it does at this stage. I'm past the point of us having to prove it. He showed you by dipping, okay, instead of going
Yeah.
talk to, right. But I think the part of what we're talking about with managing stars is you don't want to deal with someone who's difficult and declining at the same time, right? And Jimmy's declining, like not at a rapid rate. He still can be a great player at times, but he's declining. Every player would decline at his age. And I said that he had never counted on someone at his age before. Shaq never really got to that age with them, and he had already started to decline. When Dwayne came back at that age, they knew he wasn't the same player. That was mostly marketing and vibes, okay?
Feel
At
good.
the same
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I mean, 15, 16, he was still a very, very good player. We saw that purple shirt guy in the playoffs and everything else. But at that stage, so I think some of it is not wanting to manage like an ego when an ego can't understand that he's not what he was. Okay. So
I
I
think
think
that's
that's
fair.
part of it. And I think that's fair. But it's also managing availability, which was also an issue with Jimmy, but was also an issue with Dwayne, which was
Mhm.
also an issue with Shaq. Okay. Which was also an issue with Timmy, right? I'm not going to count the Zoe one because Zoe obviously had the kidney disease and then he sort of burned the bridge. Then they rebuilt the bridge. Then he came back and he came back in a different role. He subjugated his ego, which I was always impressed with, by the way. And people should check out. I don't know if it dropped today, but I'm going to listen to it. He was on the OG show with Haslam and Miller, and that's the one I've been targeting. I want to hear from Zoe.
Yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait either to hear that one.
Yeah, that's great. And they're both, and Mike and UD are both great on that show. And we want to get them both on here, as they both told me at some point they would do. So I'll check back in with both of them. But the, look, Zoe, when he came back, they were not expecting the same things from Zoe, and Zoe put his ego aside to play behind a guy in Shaq who used to insult him, okay,
Yeah.
regularly, all right? And he's coming to his franchise because it was Zoe's franchise at the time. It was becoming Dwayne's, but it still had been Zoe's. And, Zoe was the number 2 pick in the same draft that Shaq was the number 1. There was a lot of ego there. Zoe put it aside, but he was not counted on like that. What he provided in games, particularly the clincher in Dallas, like nobody was expecting those 13 minutes that he gave you. And a Heat Nation, as they say, should always be grateful to him for that. But they've had to manage this over and over. Now with Bosch, it never got to that stage again because again, fluky thing. He probably would have aged well, but because of his game and just because the way that he played, he was sort of feathery from the outside, and he didn't, he knew how to kind of uh, use his energy the right way. I think he would have been really good later, and that's the bet that they made. They never got the chance to see it, but overall, they don't want to deal with a lot of that stuff now, and they have a roster where the older players are just role pieces like Burks, Love, right? I mean, Rozier's
Mhm.
over 30 also. And it feels like that's more what they want to do. Is you've got Bam at 27, Tyler at 25, Ware, Jovic. We'll see what happens with his extension. They're not 20. Neither of them are 22 yet. Jaquez, Larson. Jaquez had a disappointing year, but again, neither of them is 24, 25 yet, even though they came in as older rookies. So they've got this collection. Then Keyshawn Johnson, we'll see what it is. Haywood's not an old player. Obviously, he and Duncan, both sort of developed late. But it feels like they don't want to front the franchise with an older guy. So as I say that to you, what do you think that means for KD?
I think ultimately Phoenix will get a better offer elsewhere if the franchise is starting to think about this a little differently. And I'm kind of with them in terms of this Jimmy situation. You have to leave that with some PTSD. Like there's trauma that comes with that whole process. And so to immediately then become attached to the hip at another player who's declining and potentially you'd have to go through this. It's just, I mean, it's risky. And I think that they seem more and more like, I don't know if risk averse is too strong, but they've been calculated and they have not been willing to just offer up everything for a player like in the Jimmy trade is an example. I mean, I'm taking that way back and he was 29 when that all went down. They weren't willing to pay top dollar. Like they let him go to Philadelphia when we knew that they were talking to Minnesota. They let him go to Philly and they tried to see that thing through. I think that if a player were to indicate that he wanted to come to Miami and he was in his 30s and he was the top player in the league, I just don't know who that player is right now. And so that's where, although I think maybe they'd be open-minded if that player was not like difficult the way Jimmy was in certain ways. I think that them trying to lean young, but not too young, because if you're too young, you're not probably winning. So this is about Durant. I honestly, I don't see it happening unless the market were to somehow change. But I think Houston or a team like that is going to be willing to give an extra first round pick or an extra young player. And the Heat will kind of have to wait for the next guy to become available. And fans are going to get upset about that. But it may cost you. Let's say you do end up with 2 picks in this draft if the Heat don't make the playoffs. It may cost you both of those picks to get Durant. And I don't know that the Heat are going to be willing to do that.
Either both of those picks or it costs you where. And so now you've basically transitioned Bam to finally play with a real big, so to speak, although Ware has some physical development that needs to be done here, but we've seen them adjust and now they're starting to win. Ware is making more sort of winning plays, so to speak, over the past few games. Again, not against the greatest competition, but you're seeing a little bit more. I think there's also an understanding, like with the way he got bullied by Zubac and some of the other bigger centers this year, like what he needs to do. So that's really the challenge this offseason. He has picked up information quicker, I think, than a lot of us believed he would based on the reports on him coming into the draft. That it's now about, okay, finding a way to put on functional weight with him, like they did with Jovic. And that's something they're very good at. And so I feel like that's going to come around. So do you really want to go the other direction? Now you're going to have Bam as a 5. Okay, you put Durant at the 4. I'm not going to argue against Durant's greatness. I was saying at the trade deadline, you do whatever you can to get him. I didn't quite mean what Phoenix was asking for, which is damn near everybody.
Everything. Yeah.
Right. But I just don't think, even if you put Durant in a situation with Bam and Tyler, it's going to be hard to put that roster together quickly. Like, even when they got Shaq, what people don't remember about the Shaq trade is they were not planning on going that direction. Okay.
No.
They drafted Darrell Wright instead of Jameer Nelson, in part because Stan didn't want a small point guard, which is kind of funny because Jameer ended up being Stan's point guard and Stan loved him in Orlando. But one of the reasons was Jameer was an older player. He played 4 years at St. Joe's. Darrell was a project, but had more upside, supposedly, right? And so they took Darrell, and then they had to stash Darrell in the G League. I went out. Their G League team, or D League at the time, used to be in Estero, right across Alligator Alley. And I spent a couple days with Darrell out there with him writing a story for the Sun Sentinel about his D League experience. So, like, it was never the plan to go get Shaq. It's just that Pat was having a meeting with Jerry Buss, the late Jerry Buss, and basically it was more so about trying to get Pat to go out and run the operation in LA. And then it was like, well, we'll trade Shaq. And then it became, okay, well, we're not giving up Dwayne. Shaq didn't want them to give up Dwayne either. And then it became Karan, it became Lamar, and obviously became Brian Grant's contract. And we hope Brian's doing okay. Brian was obviously a big part of the organization at that point, but they were not trying to that was not the plan at the time. But then they got Shaq, and it was like they had to put the pieces together. So it was like, okay, Damon Jones had played for like 7 or 8 teams at that stage. That didn't include the D League teams. We're going to make him the starting point guard, right? Eddie's going to move to the 3. Udonis, who was not a starter as a rookie, he's going to be the starter. They put this, and Keon Dooling came in. They put this team
Christian
on the
Laettner.
fly. Christian Laettner, like this was like a hodgepodge that honestly should have won the championship if Dwayne, because Shaq was playing at a high level that year, could have been MVP. Nash got the MVP. So they had a shot that year, but it wasn't because they had a lot of time to put a team together. Okay, the only reason they didn't win a title is because Dwayne pulled his ribcage muscle in Game 5 against Detroit. Otherwise, they probably win that series, and I think they would have beaten that San Antonio team that was on the other side because that was the weakest of the San Antonio teams. But they didn't get a chance to do it. And then they, of course, they won the championship. They made more moves, so it was really a 2-year plan. Like Pat made his big moves the next summer. So I kind of think the same would be true if you got Durant. I don't see that, right? I don't see them being able to put together
who's going to be the
team
in that scenario. You would have to hope that Durant comes here and at his age has Dwayne Wade level dominance to get that. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that would have to break right for you to win. Bam and Tyler would have to be their best selves. And like, it's just a lot to give up the farm for, I guess.
Well, and it's not just that. It's also, where are you getting the supporting pieces from? Because this argument is always made that if you get a star, others will want to join. And yes, if Dame had come, we had heard Kelly Oubre, Dennis Smith Jr., but again, Oubre would have been effective. Dennis Smith Jr. has had trouble staying in the league, since. But like, you might get somebody. But I don't know that you put this great team together on the fly. I mean, I guess you'd be leaning more to the younger guys who haven't gotten minutes this year, like Larson, like Keyshawn Johnson, etc.
You'd have to hope for like a Gabe and a Max scenario to happen, like where a couple guys pop that are paying vet minimum salary type, like that's the kind of stuff that would have to fill out the roster if you gave up enough young players or draft picks. But it's really, they'd probably have to give up young pieces in a Durant trade.
And the other thing with Durant, and then we'll pivot to some other guys after the break. The other thing with Durant is KD just wants to come in and ball. He doesn't want to lead. This is one of the positives with him, but it also can be a negative. Like he's not going to create waves. Excuse me. Necessarily, but it's also that his teams haven't won in a while. I mean, they tried to put a big three together in Brooklyn. He and Harden and Kyrie were never playing at the same time. Part of that was because of Kyrie's refusal to get vaccinated, and then some other issues with Harden, but then you look at Phoenix, like it's been Booker. He's fine when he was with Booker. They brought in Beal, and their minutes are all great. When Beal doesn't play, like that's a really good team. But if you look at their minutes when they add Beal, it hasn't. So it's not like just putting him together with two other players just immediately works, and then KD and Hero have to work that out too. So there's a whole bunch of things that go on here. I'm not saying you don't inquire. You inquire. You see what you can do here. But you bring him in, and then you got to manage the chemistry of it. You got to manage the injuries, the availability. He's not Jimmy difficulty, but there are things that you got to worry about when you got a guy in his late 30s. All right, on the other side of this, we'll talk about maybe some of the more realistic possibilities. And yes, we'll mention the Ja thing, since that's the hot topic today. And Memphis is in here on Thursday. Before we do, I want to mention a great sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network, our friends over at Water Cleanup. You can find them at WCUFL.com. That's your one-stop water and mold cleanup shop. Michael Robert, his team, they do a great job. They've got more than 200 5-star reviews on Google. So your home, your place of business, you don't want the leaks, you don't want the mold. Reach out to them right away. They'll get it done for you. Again, mention 5 Reasons. We always appreciate that. They do great work, not just in Boca where they're based, but also further south, all the way down to the Keys, and then all the way west. They've gone in there for storms, Fort Myers, further north, etc. Always helping people. And they'll tell you if they can't do the job, which is really, that's hard to get from a lot of contractors. So check them out. Water Cleanup of Florida. It's WCUFL.com. If you've got the schmutz,
they got the guts.
All right, so let's talk about if they're not going to go get them. Wiggins is 30, by the way, but you're not committing crazy money to him. Now, his availability has been a bit of a concern so far. He's played less than Jimmy, which is not great. He's shown some things when he has played, but I think they were hoping him to be a little bit more available. But again, you're not asking him to front the franchise. He's not really the number one pick of the draft anymore. He's a very, very, very good role player, borderline star on the right night in the right situation. I think that's and I think that's what they expect from him, that they can bring out the best in him, but they're not expecting him to lead this thing. So let me ask you this. Would you rather manage a star who's had off-court problems like John Morant and has had injury problems but is in his 20s, or an aging star who's never gotten any off-the-court trouble? I mean, he just has a bunch of burner accounts and plays video games in Kevin Durant.
I mean, this is difficult because there's a part of me that says, particularly if I try to think about this through the lens of Pat and the fact that the team has, that it's been a rough, 18 months or so. There's a part of me that says I would like to do the Durant experiment if the cost is right. The off the court stuff, I guess this is where I land on it. It's like, part of it is I think that you're going to have to take a risk somewhere. Like there's going to be no perfect scenario. I mean, I guess you could have pointed to a player like Donovan Mitchell and said, look, there was a guy available that didn't have any necessarily like off the court stuff or on the court things to manage. So maybe another guy like that pops up, but right now there's not a ton of those guys out there. I tend to want to stay away from anybody that has off the court issues on a consistent basis, but I don't know. I mean, I personally would lean Durant, even though I've said that I don't want them to overpay, but that's just because I kind of know how the Heat think about these things, and they tend to not want to go in the direction of some of the off the court problems. Like the Jimmy problems was a little different because you don't want to do media. You can be a little difficult to talk to at times, but he showed up, he worked, and he wasn't
Yeah.
getting in the tabloids. He's not in the
No.
news for the wrong
No.
things. I guess I'll lean Durant today, but it's a tough question because, and look, I'm never the one who says it's a tough question, but this is a tough one because I think the Heat would probably, it's counterintuitive to what we've talked about this whole episode. They'd rather manage somebody with less off the court issues, even if they're a little older. But then you're kind of, like you said, you box yourself in for a 2-year run.
Yeah. Well, and they've never, here's the thing. They haven't really taken on a ton of like the off court problem guys in lead roles, and Ja hasn't had an issue in a couple of years now. Okay, so we need to be fair on that. He was injured last year. Hasn't been anything of any significance this year. We know that the Heat were not really in on Kyrie like a lot of people thought they were as stuff was going on. Again, that wasn't really off-court issues, but obviously he was controversial for a variety of reasons, which, you and I may have our opinions about, but they were not, it wasn't like the kind of stuff that we've seen from some others. But look, if you look at the guys that they typically gone after, they've gone after disgruntled stars.
Correct.
Okay. Like people who were unhappy where they were like, it starts with Zoe. Okay. And Zoe's issue was really money with Charlotte at first. And, and then basically, Pat had been on the job for a few days and he called, the owner and he said, are you ready to spend 105 or 100, whatever, $110 million? And the owner said, yes. And that's how that went. Okay. And basically the Pat had a chance. He made the move. He pounced. Okay. That's now 30 years ago. Hard to believe. But then
and he had
you
temper
look,
issues just to qualify
yeah,
it.
He did. And those hurt the Heat on the court. People forget about that. But there's one of those things where we all talk about sort of glowingly about the Tim Zoe partnership there, but really Tim was ready to win right away. Zoe really wasn't. Zoe was ascending and finished second in MVP voting, and then he got sick. And by then Tim's body started to break down. Very reminiscent to what the Dolphins went through, where by the time they finally got players like Jason Taylor and Zach Thomas to lead the defense, Danny couldn't play anymore. And it was kind of the same thing. It wasn't to quite that degree, but it was close. But you look at after that, okay, so Zoe, Timmy was third string in Golden State at that point. He was playing behind BJ Armstrong, who was washed. All right. Timmy was third string coming off knee surgery. At that time, ACL tears were not something you came back from right away. And he had dealt with those. Then they went and got Mashburn, who got stuck in the mess with Jimmy Jackson and Jason Kidd and Tony Braxton, and who the hell knows what happened there. But those were the 3 J's in Dallas, and that wasn't going to work out. And then they went out. Okay, so then you go from there. Then I'm not going to say necessarily Brian Grant and Eddie Jones. They made decisions of their own. They weren't really disgruntled at that time. It was Pat couldn't get McGrady and Grant Hill, and so he moved on to Eddie, and that's how they made the moves. And they got Brian Grant when they didn't think they could. But then after that, it was Shaq, okay, who was quarreling with Jerry Buss at the time over contract extension. That's why that gave Pat's attention, right? And Kobe. And because Kobe didn't think Shaq worked hard enough. And then the Heat basically got like one more year out of him where he cared. And then that was about it. And then after that, and then you also look at it, it was Dragic. Goran's the easiest guy in the world to get along with, but he was pissed at Ryan McDonough on the way out the door. Like that was the GM in Phoenix at the time. And they were at odds, and Goran was coming off third team All NBA, and the Heat went and swooped in for him. And even Bosh and LeBron. Like LeBron has admitted recently, he thought he'd taken Cleveland as far as it could go. He needed a new challenge. And Bosh felt the same in Toronto. 7 years, I think one or two playoff appearances, never passed the first round. And then you look at Butler, who didn't get the extra year in Philadelphia that he wanted, which should have tipped the Heat off to how this was going to go if they didn't give him the contract he wanted. And whatever you want to say about Jimmy, and we've said plenty, his years wildly exceeded even our expectations at the time in a positive way. So this is what they've done, but it's been harder to get these guys. But it's disgruntled guys. It's not guys who've had off the court issues. None of those guys did.
You're right. And also like, and I don't want to say that Michael Beasley has off the court issues, but that was a kind of experience that I think the Heat, that was like a high pick that went wrong and he just never really fit in. I think that they're going to be really selective about who they give up the farm for. Cause like eventually, Ethan, we've talked about like all these players that become available. Ultimately, the Heat have never, I don't think, offered everything. maybe they have in a couple instances, but very rarely do they just offer everything. Well, who is that guy going to be? Does the team perceive what you're offering to be everything? Because obviously the Heat don't want to give up Bam, probably don't want to give up Tyler either. So there's going to have to be like circumstantial stuff that we work through for whoever this player is that they eventually find. I don't know that Ja is going to be the guy that they go after. Memphis and Miami have trade history, so I mean, who knows
They do.
there? But
And they do look like they're looking to make changes. And he was getting pushed out of that offense. But the weird part is they fired not only Taylor Jenkins, but also the assistant who was responsible for the offense. So I don't know if they're trying to make things right. I mean, he's a better player than De'Aaron Fox. We talked about De'Aaron Fox. When John Morant is at his best, he's a better player. But it's not just the off the court stuff. It's also he plays a style that I mean, I remember talking to Gary Payton once late in Dwayne's career, and he told me, he says, it was a Hall of Fame thing. And he said, I told Dwayne when I played with him, you need to stop with the acrobatic stuff. You need to stop with the above the rim stuff. That's going to catch up to you. GP said it in his own way. Ja plays that way, like the total reckless abandon. I don't know if that's he's gonna miss time. Like, this is the thing to consider. But he is a better player than De'Aaron Fox. And we were talking about De'Aaron Fox. Like, John Morant at his best has a chance to be a top 10, 15 player in the league.
for sure.
I don't think that's the case for Fox. Now, let me throw one last name at you before we go. Because this is the one guy who I think could become available if the situation falls apart, as it may with Dame's status, which is Giannis. No off the court issues ever. He's not that old yet. My only question with him is, do you give up the farm for somebody whose game may not age well? Because he's not a shooter. He's relying basically on brute force and athleticism still.
I think you have to. I don't think we can overthink this. And like I'm gearing up here to say to you, oh my gosh, you're gonna make me say that I'd have to trade Bam to get Giannis, aren't you? Because like I feel like that would be something Milwaukee would want. The Heat would obviously rather pair those two. Giannis is a player that I think can be considered pretty generational, and I don't think that you can say no to that situation. Even if you don't think his game will age well, physically, he's likely to age well. He takes care of his body. To your point, there's no off the court issues at all. But then, do you have enough assets if you're not trading Bam to get Giannis like that? And so this ends up being a kind of depressing conversation in the end of it all, because it seems like a lot of the players that are going to be up for auction in the near future, or could be, well, obviously there's names that could pop up that we don't expect. Luka got traded, damn it. But
right. It could be available again, by the way, in 2026.
Exactly.
Although I'm not expecting it, but there's other. I mean, would the Heat be concerned about his conditioning tests? Probably not. Right? Not at this stage. I think
no,
they
would get him in shape, I think. But it is a thing where none of these situations that are kind of brewing at league wide seem like the right moves for the Heat at this moment. And Heat fans are going to hate to hear that. They're going to probably say that we're cranking up the excuse machine in advance for the front office as they don't get these players. But I don't see any perfect fit at this exact moment. I think that they're probably likely to be pretty prudent and take this, like, I don't think they're going to rush it. And I think that that's counter to what everyone thought Pat would go out doing. I think that he's actually listening to the people around him, and they're taking less risks than they ever have.
They are, but I also, they know the fans are restless, and I mean, not all the fans. They're still there. They're a very high renewal rate for next year, from what I've heard. So, it's not like everything has to be done this minute. If there's growth from the young players, the general fan base might stick around a little bit and kind of watch it. If they put in a good performance, they get to the playoffs and they push Cleveland to 6 games, But I think overall, though, I think there has to be recognition that the player who's ultimately going to take them to the next level is not on the roster. It doesn't mean there aren't good players on the roster. It doesn't mean that Bam can't be a big part of that, or Tyler can't be a big part of that, or Wiggins can't be a big part of it, or maybe Ware could be a big. I mean, the players may have some pieces here. I think we agree on that. But that lead piece, like to win a championship, you need one of the best 10 players in the league playing at his highest level. or you need a guy like Jimmy who can kind of get you there.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have that right now. They don't have that guy. It's a very select few guys who've led teams to championships.
And that's not what we think. That's like, I think the organization likely would agree that like their philosophy has been go get the bet, like they go get stars. That's what they do. All these players that they've gone and gotten all throughout these years, they look for the right circumstances and they pounce. And I think that it's just going to be a scenario where Heat fans are going to have to wait for that right moment. And I know that they've been listening to this for years, so they're getting pissed. But
Right.
I think the worst thing you could do is rush this right now.
Look at the ages of the guys they've picked up. Typically, or they've gone hard after. Jimmy was what, 29. Goran was 29, I believe. You had, and I'm looking at the others. Well, Bosch was 25. LeBron was 25. That was a totally different story at that stage. But Zoe was 25. Zoe was 25 at the time. I mean, and Mashburn was, I mean, they weren't expecting him to lead, but a disgruntled guy. I think he was like 23, 24 at the time. Timmy, even as old as we think he was he probably was 29. He just,
I would think he was 29. Yeah.
I think it was, they had this history. I actually,
Look for
unfortunately,
29-year-olds.
Well, I think Rozier was 29, and I think I used it as a reason to make the trade. I'm like, they got Hardaway, they got Dragic at 29. Rozier's going to turn out the same way. Anyway, have a good night.